Hello and welcome to our channel. My name is Usman. Today I'm going to be talking about 3 mistakes that I think beginner photographers should avoid. Now, I'm not some authority in the photography industry, so you don't have to listen to me, but I have built up a good amount of experience, and I'm also going to be offering some alternatives that I think will help you develop more effectively as a creative. So the first mistake that I see a lot of beginner photographers make is shooting with really small apertures. Apertures around f16, f22, or even f32. Now the reason why this tends to happen is when beginners learn about the exposure triangle, they get taught about how with smaller apertures you get more in focus or more depth of field, which is technically true. They also get taught about light and how that impacts the exposure. So with a wider aperture, you need less light compared to a smaller aperture, which is true. What they don't get taught about generally is something called diffraction. Now diffraction, I'm not going to go too much into it, but I will leave a link below which explains it if you want to know more about it. But essentially, in practical terms, diffraction will make your image look really soft. And this kind of defeats the whole purpose of wanting more in focus. If you've got more in focus but everything is really soft and mushy, then what's the point? So shooting with really small apertures, honestly, it's not ideal. In fact, in my career, I've never really shot at f22 unless I'm shooting with a large format camera, and most professionals only use these really small apertures in a pinch. It's kind of like a last resort. It's not the first aperture that many professionals pick. Generally speaking, a lot of photographers will want to shoot around f5.6 or f8 because you get the sharpest results at those points, and if they want more of the scene in focus, they'll use different techniques. And the technique that I recommend is something called focus stacking. So I'm just going to quickly run through exactly how you focus stack, and hopefully this can help you avoid shooting with really small apertures. And I'm also going to do a side-by-side with showing you the difference between focus stacking and shooting at f22. So I'm outside my house now. Unfortunately, I couldn't go anywhere particularly nice because of the lockdown rules, but I've got my camera set up over here, and if you look at the composition, you'll be able to see that I've got the camera set up relatively low, which is giving me a good amount of foreground, midground, and background. And this is something that a lot of landscape photographers do. A lot of landscape photographers, if they've got an interesting foreground, they'll want that in focus as well as the rest of the image. And I think that's going to be a good way for us to demonstrate these techniques. So I'm going to take a bunch of pictures. The first picture I'm going to take is going to be shot at f5.6, and at f5.6 this lens, the 24 tilt shift, is pretty sharp. I'm going to show you the kind of focus you get at that aperture point. Then I'm going to stop all the way down to f22, and I'm going to show you the kind of image you can produce with that aperture, and then we're going to take a bunch of images, stack them together, and then show you the kind of image that produces, and we can do some side-by-side comparisons. So for the first image, it's simple enough. All I need to do is make sure I'm correctly focused, set the camera to f5.6 and take a picture. For the second image, simple enough, stop down the lens to f22, adjust the shutter speed so I can match the exposure, and take another picture. For the focus stack image, what you want to do is take a series of images while focusing through the scene. So for each picture, you want to change where the focus lies, and you want to make minor adjustments focusing from the closest point in the image to the furthest point in the scene. So here we have all the images opened up in Lightroom now, and for this particular stack I've taken 10 images. Now, general rule of thumb, the more images you have for the stack, the more effective the stack is going to be. However, for this particular scene, 10 is perfectly fine. Going into the develop module, you can see that I've made some slight adjustments, and I've just copied those adjustments across every single image so things remain consistent. And looking at this first image, you can see that it looks like it's out of focus, but technically it's not. The focus is just at the closest point in the image, and as you go through all of the images, you'll see how the focus point, or the point of focus, is changing. And when we come to the final image over here and I zoom in, you can see that the houses in the back are in focus, whereas the pavement on the front is no longer in focus. And that's essentially what you want to do. You want to focus through the scene front to back. Once you're happy with all the adjustments you've made in Lightroom, there are 2 ways that you can create a focus stacked image. So you've got all the images selected, right click, edit in, and open as layers in Photoshop. Once you have all the images opened up in Photoshop, make sure you've selected them all and click on edit, auto blend layers, stack images, and hit OK. Now, I'm not going to do it in Photoshop because personally, I don't like the results that Photoshop produces. It can be a little hit or miss. Instead, I like using this piece of software called Helicon Focus. So coming back into Lightroom, the way that I prefer to use Helicon Focus is directly from Lightroom. And once you've done all your adjustments and you've got all the images selected, you go into the export menu, and in the export menu, you have a Helicon Focus option. So it does integrate into Lightroom to some degree. And once you've selected all the options that you want, so I've got TIFF, Adobe RGB, you just hit export. And after about 15 or 20 seconds, all the images should appear in Helicon Focus, and this is fairly straightforward. I generally select method B, but you can select whichever one you prefer, and you just hit render. And Helicon Focus is really quick at creating that final stacked image. Now, as you can see, there has been a slight error in the sky, and this is because the clouds, and obviously there were some significant movement in the clouds and the light, so that created an issue. But honestly, this is such an easy fix with a layer mask in Photoshop. It's not a problem at all. Personally, Helicon Focus does a significantly better job than Photoshop, so I still recommend this over the Photoshop stacking features. And I'm not affiliated with them. I have got no connection with them at all. I paid for this software myself. It costs about £30 or something, so it's very, very reasonable. And once everything's done, you click on File, Save, and I'm feeling a bit lazy, so I'm just going to save this on my desktop, and I can't be bothered renaming it, so save. And that's basically it, and the image will be saved as a TIFF file on my desktop, and you can bring that back into Lightroom. So now we've got the final images opened up in Lightroom. We've got the f5.6 image, the f22 image, and the focus stacked image. So let's put them side by side. Let's put the f5.6 versus the f22 image in next to one another. And you know, this image does have a little bit more in focus, because if we zoom into the front over here, you can see that this is more in focus, and you know, it's sharper in comparison to the f5.6 because this is definitely not in focus. However, if we start moving across the frame, you can see how the f5.6 image is noticeably sharper. I mean, it's a lot sharper, and it's got more contrast. Like, this just looks muddy and soft, and it doesn't look that detailed. Like, look at the distance over here. So the places where the image is in focus, the f22 image just doesn't look that great. It looks soft, it lacks contrast, and it just isn't pleasing to look at. Compare that to the focus stack image, and you'll see even at the closest point, the focus stack image is significantly sharper. I mean, it's got all the sharpness of that f5.6 image, but across the whole frame. And you can see even in the trees, even at the distance, the building, basically everywhere you look, the focus stacked image looks significantly sharper. It's got that contrast as well because it doesn't look muddy and soft, and it's got that sharp detail throughout the whole image. So this is why, if you're trying to get more focus in an image, focus stacking is the best option, and stopping down to f22 really doesn't give the results. I mean, look at this section versus this section. It's night and day in terms of how sharp one is versus the other. The second mistake that I see a lot of beginner photographers make is HDR, or high dynamic range, or going way overboard on HDR to be precise. Now, if you're shooting a particular scene where the brightest point and the darkest point isn't something you're able to capture in one exposure with your camera, then you can take multiple exposures and stack them together. The problem is when you're stacking these images with certain bits of software, you can go a little bit overboard, and it starts to look pretty terrible, starts to look like a cartoon as opposed to what the scene actually looked like. And this is something that I think a lot of photographers, a lot of beginner photographers should avoid. It was something that a lot of people were doing about 5 or 6 years ago. Fortunately, that fad has run its course, but I still see some beginners doing it. They tend to push the highlights and the shadows way beyond necessary, and then it just doesn't look that great. The contrast is gone, and it just doesn't look pleasing. Instead, I recommend pull back on these settings. Don't go overboard with this. If you do want to use software to stack exposures properly and correctly, then the software I recommend is something called Raya Pro. It's by an individual called Jimmy McIntyre. I don't know him. I don't know anyone at that company. I bought this software with my own money, so I'm not affiliated with this in any way, shape or form. I don't even have an affiliate link. I'm just going to put the website in the description. But this software is something that I think is really, really good. I highly recommend it, and I'm going to show you how you can use this software to produce better looking HDR images without that fake cartoonish type look. So here we have 4 images opened up in Lightroom now, going from darkest to the brightest, and if I go through them individually, you can see that I've made some slight adjustments to them, and the adjustments are based on what the image exposure is, because I'm trying to bring them as close to what I want as a final image. And what I'm going to do is first I'm going to use the HDR blending feature in Lightroom, and I'm going to show you what it looks like when you just use 2 images, which is going to be the second and the fourth. And if we just do right click, photo merge and HDR, and Lightroom will show you what it thinks is going to look like. And you know, this looks pretty harsh, it doesn't look that great, so we're going to cancel that, and I'm now going to use all 4 images and see how that impacts the final output. And it's better, you know, it looks better. So we're going to merge that into an HDR file, and then I'm going to take all 4 images into Photoshop, and I'm going to show you how to use Raya Pro. Let's just move this over here. So now we've got all 4 images opened up in Photoshop, and I'm only going to be using these 2 images, which is the second and the fourth in Lightroom. So I'm going to move this one up here. So this is the brightest image, and then this was the second darkest image, and we're going to put them together. And Raya Pro is honestly brilliant. So I've got it over here. So this is the Raya Pro hub. Now I'm not going to go too much into it, but I highly recommend it, because one of the brilliant things about Raya Pro is as soon as you buy a particular version, you've got free updates for life, which is honestly crazy. But I'm very thankful at the fact that I get free updates for life. So I bought it on Raya Pro 2. I'm now on 5 and I didn't pay a penny for the update. So we're going to use precision mask. So I don't need to press that because I've got precision masks over here. And all I'm going to do is I've got the brightest image selected. I'm going to click on Auto Bright. And then Raya Pro is going to create a number of different options that I can use for my potential HDR. Now this already looks a lot better than what I had in Lightroom. So we've got the sky, we've got the shadows, and you know, there's that contrast, there's that detail, it just looks a bit better. But if you go through the different options, so this is number 1, and then you can select which exposure you want to go with and which you think is going to look the best. Now I think number 2 looks the best, so I'm going to go with that. And you can also edit things as well, so you can go into the edit option over here, and then you can make even more adjustments if you want to be a bit more precise. But I think it's about right, so I don't need to do too much with it. And then you just hit select, and there you have it. So I didn't even use these 2 images, I just used 2 images to blend this. And I'm going to now flatten that down into 1 image. I'll make some adjustments to it in Camera Raw. So I think I could just increase the exposure slightly, shadows, bring down the highlights a little bit. And here we go. And you know, I'd obviously do a little bit more. Maybe this is a little bit too much in terms of the brightness and shadows as well. I'm going to do a little bit more to just make some slight adjustments to the highlights and shadows and brightness. And then I'm going to bring this back into Lightroom. So back in Lightroom now, and this was the brightest image that I used towards the blend. And if I compare that to the HDR that I produced in Lightroom, you can see, yes, we've got the sky back, but it does look pretty harsh. However, compare that to the blend that we created in Raya Pro or Photoshop. Look at the difference. Like, this is the Raya Pro image and this is the Lightroom image. Look at how much more natural this looks like. This looks like a real scene, and this looks like something that you'd edit on a smartphone or something, and it just looks really harsh, like it's trying to make my eyes bleed or something. It just doesn't look very pleasing. But this, you've got the highlights in the sky, you can see the sun, you can see the clouds, but you can also see the shadows, and it doesn't look unnatural. It doesn't look overdone. And the thing is, with Lightroom, I didn't even do a lot. All I did was just use the auto settings in Lightroom HDR, and this is what it produced. But with Raya Pro, one, you've got significantly more control, and I didn't even do a great deal to it. All I did was selected option 2 and then increase the exposure in post just to get this image. So it looks far more natural, and I highly recommend people just, you know, pull back on the settings, pull back on how much you apply that HDR look, and try and go for a more natural looking image as opposed to something that looks like this, which honestly is a little difficult to look at. So yeah, HDR. This is something that I think I see a lot of beginner photographers going really overboard on, and I think that with the right tools you can make better blended images. And Lightroom or a lot of normal typical HDR software just isn't really that great. And the third mistake that I see a lot of beginner photographers make is using a technique called selective color. I say technique. This is honestly pretty cheap and quite tacky and almost never works. In fact, this is so bad that I don't have a proper alternative to it. The only thing I'm going to say is don't do it. If you're wondering what selective color is, essentially it's where you have a black and white image with one thing in color. The only time this properly worked, was in that brilliant movie Schindler's List. And the only reason why it worked is because there was a story element to it. There was a context, there was a narrative that was linked to that use of selective color. It wasn't just there in a vacuum. It wasn't just put there for no reason. There was a whole context behind it, and that's why it worked. So instead of using selective color, focus more on your composition, on your lighting, and the way that you tell a narrative or tell a story with your images. And if you're building a story, if you've got a concept in mind and you've got that story which requires selective color, then maybe. But you don't work on it in reverse. You don't go from selective color to try and tell the story. Your story has to be there first before you go towards selective color. Otherwise, you're working in reverse. So those are 3 mistakes that I think beginner photographers should avoid. If you like this video, hit the like button, please subscribe, share this video. Also, check out our store on the website. I'll leave a link below, and hope to see you guys in the next one. Thank you.